This year, Freddie Mac commissioned Community Marketing and Insights to produce a nationwide study exploring housing-related trends specific to the LGBT community. With us to share insights on behalf of Freddie Mac is Angie Wilen. Angie is the Director of HR Innovation at Freddie Mac. In her current HR role, she is tasked with challenging the status quo with next-gen HR-related concepts and thinking. Also with us is David Paisley. Hi. I like the dimple. I was distracted for a second. The Adderall hasn't kicked in yet. David Paisley is a Senior Research Director with Community Marketing and Insights, the world's leading LGBTQ market research firm, working with brands, universities, and government institutions since 1992. David has been with CMI for over 23 years and coordinates the company's LGBT quantitative and qualitative client research projects. Please give a warm welcome to the dynamite team of Angie Wilen and David Paisley.
Is this thing on? Hey. I'm jazzed to be here today. So, as he mentioned, I'm Angie Wilen, Director of HR Innovation at Freddie Mac, and I think one of the primary thoughts in this room is HR at NAGLREP. So let me just address that a little bit. I've been with Freddie Mac for about 9 years, and I have been privileged to lead a number of initiatives, LGBT initiatives, with Freddie Mac. Primarily internally, but in the context of today, I have been privileged to partner with our lines of business, with Community Marketing and Insights to commission this study. And I'm so excited that we get to share our results with you. The second connection worth noting is a more personal one, sort of unofficial, not Freddie Mac, but on a personal level, I can candidly tell you that my LGBT identity has influenced where I choose to work, where I choose to live, and in all candor, it has influenced who I chose as my real estate agent when I purchased my home in Washington, D.C. in 2012. So that's a little bit about me. I'll let David share a little bit about himself.
Great. Again, my name is David Paisley. I'm the Senior Research Director at Community Marketing and Insights. For those of you that don't know us, we're San Francisco based. We've been actually around for a long time. We do a lot of the background studies and research for corporations and also government agencies around LGBT-specific issues, from health to buying to purchasing. And a little bit about my own self. I used to live in San Francisco for over 20 years. I recently became more of a local boy. I've been part of the gay migration to Joshua Tree, California, and bought a home in Joshua Tree about 3 years ago, and I actually work out of Joshua Tree now, like many people do. So it's been a great transition for me to be like a rural gay almost. So. And thank you to NAGLREP for having us. So I'll be the urban,
he'll be rural, and we'll present this. All right, so let's jump in.
All right, so a little bit about the study. I want to let you know what we're doing. Like, you may see LGBT research out there, and one of the complaints I have about LGBT research sometimes is that it will often be like 500 LGBT people, and the research is saying LGBT people do this or think that. And from CMI's perspective, it's somewhat useless because the LGBT actually represent 4 very different market segments. So I think one thing that we really specialize in or can provide is LGBT market research that has a significant number of people that you can actually break down between generation, between gender, between ethnicity. So this particular research for Freddie Mac was a 10-minute online survey in April 2018. We have a representative sample of people 21 to 73 from all 50 states. There were about 2,300 LGBT people in the survey. It was pretty evenly divided between men and women, and we also did an oversample of the transgender community to make sure that we really had their opinion. And then we weighted the data to be equal between men and women and just about 6% gender expansive because we did overrepresent that sample. So that's sort of the basic background of it.
A quick FYI, you are getting some very, very current data. We, Freddie Mac, just put out a press release on Monday. So if you want to get access to this data, you can take a look. You can reach out to David or myself, but if you go to Freddie Mac's website, you'll find the survey directly there. So this is the first big insight we found. Now, I will tell you that we looked at a number of studies that have already been commissioned across the country, and we found there already is a lot of data about the LGBT in housing, but nothing robust enough that would allow us to really explore the diversity within the LGBT community. And so that was one of the big intentions of this particular effort. And this is one of the big ahas that we had. I think we all know in this room, U.S. general population, overall homeownership rates in this country, 64%. So we were curious what that meant for the LGBT community. And if you can take a look here, broadly, it is significantly lower. So overall, LGBT homeownership rates are 49%. And when you cut it by certain demographics, you can get some sort of additional insights. Lesbians, gay men, over half are homeowners, but still well below 64%. The bisexual community, 48% in this survey. I would be remiss if I didn't sort of caveat that with it could well be influenced by the younger demographic represented in the bisexual community. Gender expansive, 2 in 3 respondents were in fact not homeowners. And we'll get into a little bit about what additional insights this survey provided. The other piece worth noting, we know, based on U.S. Census data, I suspect many in this room are aware, when you cut it by certain demographics, we know that homeownership rates for the Latino community, for Black African American community, are lower writ large. Now, when you explore the intersectionality here, when you explore the LGBT community for these demographics, they are even lower. So now you've got Latino at 35%, whereas U.S. Census overall Latino homeownership is 48%. Black at 30%, whereas overall census for Black African American community is 42%. David, I don't know.
So overall, LGBT homeownership rate actually falls about 10 to 12% depending on the demographic. Does that surprise people here? Yeah? Okay. This study isn't coming out of the blue, by the way. We actually expected these results. There have been a number of smaller studies around over the last few years that actually showed the exact same thing. So the purpose of the study was not to have an aha moment about this particular issue, because we actually suspected what the results would be. What the purpose of this study was to see if we could replicate the results, which we did, but then have enough people to see how it breaks down within the L, G, B, and T, and also to see what happens with millennials and different ethnicities. What I would also say about the general population is that it actually drops off a lot more with millennials than it does with baby boomers. Actually, it's still pretty much lower for baby boomers, but it closes a little bit over time. The other thing I want to say is this question is based on the concept of living in your primary housing space. We did follow that up with people who maybe were renting to see if they owned real estate of any kind for whatever reason. And you'll actually see that the home ownership or the real estate ownership rates will pop up 2 or 3% from all these percentages pretty well across the board when you add people that may have a vacation home or other kinds of rental real estate. So it does come up a little bit. All right, perhaps not surprising, the number one thing that people own is single-family homes. I think the most important thing in this chart, it's really not that surprising, the chart, but actually condominium ownership is actually a little bit higher than the national averages, and that actually is being fueled by gay men, mostly living in urban destinations. I also want to talk about, we looked at both homeowners and renters in this particular research. And we asked this question if you agree or disagree. And the 2 greens are strongly agree and somewhat agree. The reds are to disagree. And first of all, we did homeownership. And nothing of this surprises you. Homeowners generally feel at 95% that it's right for their current goals. 95% are in agreement that it's a good financial investment. That's part of their American dream. And it's also common amongst their friends. So strong positive here. We weren't really so concerned about the homeowners. We were concerned about the next one, which was the renters. And we were wondering what renters today within the LGBT community really think. Now, as you maybe remember from the first slide, and not surprising, is that LGBT homeownership is higher with older or baby boomers. It's also higher with white, which means renters, by nature, are going to be a little bit higher in percentages with younger people and also the Latino and African American community. So what we really wanted to understand for these people who are renters is, do they buy into any of these concepts? And the good news here is they largely do. It's lower, but 79% feel that it's still a good financial investment amongst renters, and 65% feel that homeownership is part of their American dream. So I think that is a good sign. A lot of these folks are millennials, and they are buying in, I think, to the concept of homeownership and for the future. Next question. You said that you rent your primary home. Do you want to be a homeowner in the future? And in this case, we have 72% said they do want to rent a home in the future, and only 11% said they did not. So again, another really positive statistic indicating that the LGBT renters today do want to be homeowners. And on the bottom of the screen, if we break it out by the different identities, lesbian and gay men are about the same, but even as we go through with bisexual and gender expansive, it's pretty positive. I also should define gender expansive. It's, as a term, it might not be familiar to everyone here. It's actually a term that comes more out of the youth LGBT community, but it defines people that have identities that are both transgender but also non-binary. All right, the next slide. Do you now live in the same general location, either a county, city, or metro, as where you went to high school? So this is one of the big drivers of why we think LGBT people are less likely to be homeowners. Now, in this particular question, we only found that 32% said that they live in the same general location as where they grew up. Now, in the general population, these kind of questions tend to be a little bit different the way they're asked when you do their comparative research, but it's in the 50 to 60% typically. So there's this big drop in the LGBT community that is actually living where they grew up. And I don't think that's a big surprise to anyone in this room, but it really does, I think, affect homeownership, particularly for young people, because I think sometimes you need to live in an area for a while before it becomes sticky to you that you want to buy a home. But for particularly LGBT millennials, they tend to have moved from where they live. Now, they move for a lot of different reasons. You might be thinking that their place is LGBT unfriendly, and that's why they left, and that is true for a lot of people. But we did ask the question of why did you move amongst the millennials, and they're largely moving for economic and educational reasons. And then LGBT was actually the third reason that they moved, beyond education and economic opportunity. All right, we asked a bunch of questions around this. On a 4-point scale, how important are these considerations when you choose a location to live? What this particular research did is we picked 12 what we thought were common reasons that people might choose a location to live. This is amongst both homeowners and renters. And we added one LGBT component into the 12 areas. And we found that the concept of considering to be an LGBT-friendly place to live was number 4 of 12. So not highest. The highest was cost, and that's obvious. Whenever you're looking at housing, renting, or owning, cost is going to be the number 1 consideration. Low crime was number 2. Neighborhood well-maintained was number 3, but much more important to the homeowners on the left-hand side. And LGBT-friendly place to live was about 4 for both, actually a little bit higher for renters. The other thing I think is also interesting with this particular chart is that renters have a tendency to be more concerned about convenience, things like close to work, walkability to restaurants and such. And that might be partially because they're more millennials there. But overall, it's relatively consistent between homeowners and renters. So what I want to stress here is that LGBT-friendly and place to live is actually a real big consideration for the LGBT community, but it's not their only, and it's not even their number 1. You know, cost and crime and some of those other common things are just as important.
The only other thing I would point out with respect to this data is the bottom note, close to my biological family. More than 2 in 3 respondents said that was not important, which relates to the previous slide. You know, mobility seems to be a driver here and a reoccurring theme in a lot of the data we found in the study.
Also, near the bottom, a good place to raise children in good schools. That was relatively low, but that's just because LGBT parents is lower in our demographic, and we'll talk about that actually a little bit more in a little bit. All right, the next slide. When it comes to selecting a community or neighborhood to live, what is more important to you? And then we also caveated that is try not to choose very important, because we wanted to be sort of clear on the priorities. So these were mostly LGBT-specific reasons. And what I find interesting about this chart is number 1 was feel safe for LGBT people, a lack of LGBT harassment and violence. When you look at LGBT research as a whole, this whole concept of safety becomes very, very important across a lot of industries, particularly in the travel industry, where LGBT people tend to travel to destinations where they feel safe first. LGBT-friendly may not be so important, or at least an LGBT like Mecca, like Palm Springs, maybe not so important, but the concept of feeling safe in travel becomes very important. And we see that here in the real estate industry, true, is that feeling safe is really important. The number 2 one I think is really interesting, and I think this is important for you as real estate agents because you understand this a little bit, but the overall vibe of a neighborhood feels like a place I belong. Right? So what does that mean? It's sort of a little bit vague, but I think you as a real estate agent get to know your client a little bit and can understand that of their client of what is the vibe, what they're looking for, and is it a place that they feel are going to be comfortable and can steer people a little bit. Low violent crime rate was important, but number 4 on this list, and number 4, was sexual orientation, anti-discrimination laws, and protections. What I'll also add in the bottom is that the bottom 2 here, many LGBT people already live in the area. Not as important. I'm not saying it's not important to anyone, but it wasn't a real driver. And also residents that have similar political views to me wasn't really a driver. So it was a concept of safety and being into a neighborhood that they felt like that they belonged. But I think that could have a different interpretation for all people. All right, now we're going to go into a little bit of some of the other drivers that we think are really lowering home ownership.
You want me to take this one? So one of the big drivers had a lot to do with family and relationship status. So we dug into this a little bit. And what you'll find is there does appear to be a correlation between marriage and home ownership, where you've got nearly more than two-thirds, 74% of those who responded as being married responding favorably, whereas single you're only at 33%. So do you own or rent? Do you rent or own your home or primary living space? There is a clear correlation that we're seeing with respect to marriage, and we'll get into parental status in just a little bit.
Right. And I think this has the importance of marriage equality as a whole, as I think part of the point of marriage is to stabilize relationships and stabilize the community. And to some degree that's happening within LGBT too, is that marriage equality, I think, stabilizes relationships, and stable relationships lead to home ownership. So I think marriage equality, as we as a community have more experience with marriage and more get married, could help drive these home ownership rates overall up. I also think another question we asked, does owning a home make my marriage more stable? And more than half agreed with that as a concept. And I agree with that. I mean, I'm married. I actually married 3 times in California to the same guy until it stuck with that whole area. But I'll tell you, marriage makes my relationship more stable because when he drives me crazy, I just can't walk away, right? It's not that easy. And having a home makes it a lot more stable. So I think this whole concept of marriage equality, more and more LGBT people getting married over time should drive up home ownership rates. Now I want to talk about parents.
So, being an LGBT parent, strong correlation with home ownership rates. So when you asked, do you have children under the age of 18, you got a 60% response rate. But interestingly, 63% if you had a child of any age, right? And there's a big difference between that 63% and the 43% we got for those respondents who reported not being parents.
And I would also say the second part, as a parent, I would prefer to own my home instead of renting. And the vast majority of parents strongly agree with that. So again, if we look at LGBT parent rates in the United States, it is lower than the general population. They're coming up really strongly with lesbian and bisexual women, but the gay and bisexual men still lag as far as being parents. But as more and more LGBT community members become parents, again, I think the ownership rate will increase. And I think this next slide becomes really important, is that we asked millennials without children, do you want to have children in the future? And what you'll see here is that there's a relatively small no section. Only about 1 out of 4 will say no, while the rest, about half, are saying yes, and then the rest, another quarter, are saying unsure. So we've talked a lot within our industry of the LGBT baby boom, and there is an LGBT baby boom right now. It's really, right now, really strong with millennial women and Generation X women, and it's starting to come up with the men. But I think as more and more LGBT people become parents, again, we'll have a higher parent rate. So Angie and I were talking about what were the 3 drivers, or 4 drivers that I think were lowering the LGBT marriage homeownership rates, and I think Angie will talk about the last one, which is discrimination at the end. But I think the other 3 are the mobility factor, is that LGBT people still, to this day, are quite mobile and popping around the country, lack or lower marriage rates and lower parent rates. Now, I think this series of slides is really interesting. We asked a question, do you live in an LGBT-friendly state? And somewhat complicated slide, so I just want to explain it to you. On the left-hand side, we have what I'm going to call more liberal states. In the middle section, I'm going to call more, mid-range states. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have more conservative states. So when we ask the first question, I live in an LGBT-friendly state, what you're going to find here is that, and not surprising, is that people in liberal states think their state's really friendly. Those that are in more conservative states feel that it's not so friendly. But then we asked, do I live in an LGBT-friendly city or town? And I think this is really important to your work, is that LGBT people tend to find a way to find an LGBT-friendly space where they are, right? So even if we look in the most conservative places, it's not as friendly as, say, people living in California, but those living in Alabama and Arkansas and Kentucky and Mississippi seem to have found a city or town that makes sense to them. And I looked at that in my own experience when I was looking for a house in the Joshua Tree area. I really wanted to live in Joshua Tree. I really fell in love with the area. And your choices up there are Yucca Valley, which can be somewhat conservative. It can be Joshua Tree, which is a little hippy-dippy rock climber environmentalist. And it also can be 29 Palms, which is mostly a marine base. In my own projection with me and my partner, we chose Joshua Tree, which a lot of gay people do. They end up finding Joshua Tree because it is such a more liberal community and a more red or conservative environment. That dynamic plays out in a lot of different places and states. And then finally we asked, I live in an LGBT-friendly neighborhood. Those rates are similar to the LGBT-friendly city or town. They actually drop a little bit, and this is amongst renters and homeowners. And I think what this might show, although it's a little marginal statistically, is that sometimes people want to live in LGBT-friendly places or neighborhoods, but sometimes maybe can't afford it.
Also, worth noting, the question might come up, what did you mean by LGBT-friendly? So just for context, this is how it was worded. So as the reader took the survey, it's their perception about LGBT-friendliness and what that actually means to them.
We also asked the question, do you live in an LGBT-friendly country, by the way? And 5% strongly agreed with that today, but most somewhat agreed with it. So there is some reservations today about that question. That wasn't true when we did that kind of research 4 years ago, but something changed. All right, so what has prevented you from owning a home today? Not surprising to anyone in this room, the two things that are preventing LGBT renters from owning a home is not enough for the down payment and a high cost of living where I live or lived, and then can't afford the monthly mortgage. So what's really preventing people is the financial side. So then beyond that, we asked a couple questions around those obstacles. And the first question is, to the best of your knowledge, if you purchased a home today, what is the percentage of the home sale price do lenders require borrowers to pay for a down payment? And of interesting, of just the renters who wanted to own their home, 29% had no idea, and 25% thought it was 20% or more. So the vast majority of these renters who want to own a home are really quite clueless and uneducated about the reality of buying a home. And that's, again, where people can come in and education comes in. Helpful resources when buying a home. What were the most helpful resources for you when you're navigating a home and buying processes? And the real estate agent by far was number one and far higher than the real estate listing websites. So that was really important. These were homeowners that all purchased in the past 5 years. And what we did find was largely really, we had some verbatim sections in the research, some really, I think, really positive things the LGBT community said about the real estate agent community. All right, now I'm going to turn it over. We're going to talk about that number 4 reason. If the other 3 reasons we've really identified were mobility, marriage rates, and parent rates, there was a 4th issue, though.
Which is right behind me. So this was the other piece that sort of gave us pause, or it gave me pause, I should say, on a personal level in this particular study. So we looked at this in 2 ways. The subject of discrimination, what do we know about the perceptions or experiences of LGBT renters? And then what do we know about homeowners in terms of their actual experiences? So I want to share with you some of these insights. So the compelling thing here is when we asked homeowners, regardless of whether you want to purchase a home or not, do you fear any type of discrimination in the home buying process? 46% said yes. And in fact, only 15% said not sure. And so let's explore a little bit about how this breaks down. The gender expansive community, 69% worry about discrimination somewhere in the home buying process. A little bit less gay men, 1 in 3. The majority of the lesbian respondents, 54%, noted some sort of fear in the discrimination process. And interestingly, when you take it a little bit to the other demographics, Latino, Black, high. 53% for Black African American respondents who identified as LGBT, and interestingly, 58% for those who reported that they were parents. What, if anything, just a show of hands, did this data point surprise folks? I'm seeing maybe very few hands. So let's contrast that with homeowners themselves, right, if you don't mind. So we asked homeowners themselves, have you experienced discrimination somewhere in the home buying process, including lenders, loan officers, agents, sellers? Have you experienced it? 13% said yes, so more than 1 in 10. And you can tell almost 20% or 1 in 5 lesbians reported this, 1 in 10 gay men, 1 in 10 bisexual, 14%, so elevated for gender expansive as well. And you'll see some of the same elevations for Black and Latino at 23% reported actual discrimination somewhere in the home buying process, Latino 15%. There's another interesting insight worth noting on this slide. The follow-on question to this, have you experienced discrimination recently, like in the last 5 years or so? That number drops down to 4%. So from 13% to more recent 4%. I would be remiss if David didn't share his key insight, please.
Yeah, well, the other really, I think, insight is we asked that 4% to describe their discrimination experience. I can tell you it's coming from 2 places. Real estate agents by far was number 1. And the type of discrimination they were experiencing is that, and honestly, maybe people in this room don't understand this or can't appreciate it, but it is something to take back to your maybe home offices, is that we did have not many people who described situations where when the realtor found out they were LGBT, the realtor dropped them because they don't work with LGBT people. That's really happening out there. We had real estate agents that refused to show people in the gay neighborhood because they don't sell there and they refuse to sell there. And that kind of stuff was really happening and being described. The other place that was being described, and way too frequently, was people who found homes they wanted to purchase, and when the seller found out that they were LGBT, refused to sell them to them. And that was really happening out there. So that kind of stuff was happening more, I'm going to say, red states than blue states. But we did get a lot of descriptions about that, and it is something that's real and something that needs to be talked about because it is happening out there.
And 4% is low. And worth pointing out that, our goal is 0, right? This room's goal is we want to see 0% experiencing discrimination somewhere in the home buying process. So I suspect you may want to know where you can get this data. I would encourage you, we tried to sort of slim down the URL by using tinyURL, but if you go to freddiemac.com or if you go to freddiemac.com/research, you'll find this study in our press release. You're more than welcome to reach out to David or myself, or our media contact, which is linked right to the study, Chad Wandler. And if you're interested in this type of data, I would also direct you to other resources. There are, beyond the scope of this study, but there is some real data in terms of the aging LGBT community and their experience with housing. There is data about LGBT youth homelessness out there. Again, beyond the scope of this study, but certainly there is a lot of information out there if you want to understand the journey of the LGBT homeowner or renter and their experience with housing in the United States.
So in conclusion, I think with this research and many other research projects found before this is that in the LGBT community, we do underrepresent as homeowners. I think what we did with Freddie Mac and identified the reasons for that, and I think everyone in this room can work towards improving the situation and getting more LGBT people into their own homes. So thank you so much.